Hey guys, today we are going to talk about Chapter 1, Section 3 in our biology topics. And this chapter section is all about methods of science. So, what are the scientific methods and all the steps that are involved with that? Um, as usual, if you need to slow things down a bit and push pause and read the slides and rewind to hear it explained again, that's perfectly fine. But first, I want you guys to look at this statement here that says, biologists use specific methods when conducting research. I want you to take a second, think about that. Think about what are some of the things that a biologist might do to prepare and conduct some research. So think about that, push pause. After about a minute, continue the video, and we'll keep on going. All right, hopefully you had a minute to think about that. But yeah, today we're going to talk about how biologists use certain things to conduct their research. Like, what are those steps to these methods that we're going to talk about? Here are today's essential questions or main ideas. What are the differences between an observation and an inference? What are the differences among a control, independent variable, and a dependent variable? What are the scientific methods a biologist uses for research? And why are the metric system and SI units of measurement important? So, after we are finished here, if you know the answer to these questions, you are in a really good place. You know exactly what you need to know. Before we go any further, it might be helpful for you to read Chapter 1, Section 3. So if you haven't, pull that up and read that first, and then carry on. Okay. All scientific inquiry begins with observation. Observation is how you take in the things that are around you. You do it with your senses. You can see it, hear it, smell it, touch it, or taste it. The things that you sense are what you observe. Scientific inquiry involves asking questions and processing information from a variety of reliable resources. People who have done things in the past, or things that you literally see right in front of you. These are all good ways to observe the things around you. So scientific inquiry begins with an observation, which is a direct method of gathering information in an orderly way. The process of combining what you know with what you have learned to draw logical conclusions is called inferring. And then the conclusions that you come up with, those are called inferences. So if you need to think about it, the difference between an observation and an inference, well, an observation is what you literally observe, and an inference is when you take those observations and things that you know and draw a conclusion, and the conclusion is the inference. And then the methods that scientists use to gather data and answer questions are referred to as scientific methods. You've probably heard the scientific method over and over. At this point, you're in high school, and you've probably talked about it in elementary school and middle school, but you're going to hear it a lot in any science class, even future science classes. So it's probably pretty important to know the scientific method, and that's what we're going to talk about in a second. But the scientific method is, again, what scientists use to gather data and answer questions. An important part of the scientific method is to form a hypothesis. A hypothesis is a testable explanation of a situation. You've probably heard someone call it an educated guess, which is another good way of explaining it. A hypothesis is just a really good guess about what's going to happen to a question that you've come up with. When a hypothesis is supported by data from multiple investigations, the hypothesis is usually considered valid and is accepted by the scientific community. If the hypothesis is not supported by scientific investigations, the hypothesis is revised and additional investigations are conducted. So again, a hypothesis is a really good guess, and it's something that can be tested to figure out if it's correct or incorrect. Another part of the scientific method is to conduct an experiment. When a scientist conducts an experiment, they investigate a phenomenon in a controlled setting to test a hypothesis. A controlled setting means part of the experiment isn't modified or affected in any way, and part of it is, and then you can take the results of both and compare them to one another. So the control group in an experiment is the group that's used for comparison, and the experimental group is the group that's exposed to the factor that's being tested. So the things that you change are part of the experimental group, and then you can go back and compare it to the control group, which was not changed. The design of your experiment is pretty important. During a controlled experiment, only one factor can change at a time. We have our variables and our constants that are very important to our experiment. We have an independent variable, which is the tested factor that might affect the outcome of the experiment. We have the dependent variable, which results from or depends on changes to the independent variable. So the dependent variable depends on the independent variable. And then we have constants, which are factors that remain fixed during an experiment, while the independent and dependent variables change. So a constant is never going to change. It's going to remain constant. It's going to stay exactly the same throughout the entire duration of the experiment. During an experiment, it's also very important to gather data. As scientists test their hypothesis, they gather data, which is information gained from observations. There are two types of data. We have quantitative data and qualitative data. Quantitative data can be controlled as numbers, such as measurements of time, temperature, length, and mass, etc. Quantitative data is always going to be numbers. It's a quantity. It's a numerical value. So when you hear quantitative, think numbers. Qualitative data are descriptions of what our senses detect. So what do you see? What do you hear? What do you observe? So think qualitative or quality. What's the quality of what you're looking at? Data can be organized in many ways. Some people organize in notebooks, tables, charts, graphs. Um, your data just needs to be very well organized so that you're able to refer to it and know what you're talking about. Okay, when you collect data, you have to perform an investigation. Not all scientific inquiry is based on controlled experiments. Investigations rely on observation and collection of data rather than manipulating variables. So in this case, you're not performing an experiment, you're just measuring things. In science, we typically are going to use the metric system because the metric system, it's a system that most of the world uses, except for the United States for some reason. But the rest of the world uses the metric system. Um, the way the metric system works is everything is divided by powers of 10. You might remember this from when we did our physics topics. SI units, or International System of Units, these are used in science for consistency and ease of communication. So for you guys, based on our second and third quarters, we used a lot of the metric system, so you're pretty good at knowing that. Just remember that it's used with divisions that are each powers of 10, and the metric system is a whole lot easier to use than the standard system of measurements. Okay, once you have your data, it's important to analyze your results and figure out what's going on. So after data collection, scientists use analyses to ask questions such as, has my hypothesis been supported? Or are more data needed? Patterns in data can be displayed in tables and graphs, and then data analysis determines if the hypothesis is supported or rejected. So you do your experiment, you collect your data, you look at it, and it's either going to say, hey, your hypothesis was absolutely correct, or it might say, your hypothesis was completely wrong. Now, the wonderful thing about this, that doesn't mean your experiment was a failure, because you still learned what the results of the data was. Just because your hypothesis was wrong does not mean you didn't learn something. You didn't figure out an outcome of your experiment. So data, even if it refutes your hypothesis, does not mean you failed. It just means you figured out the truth. You figured out what the actual answer to your experiment and your question needs to be. So finally, you're going to report your conclusions. Before a scientist can publish their findings, it must be peer reviewed. If the reviewers agree on the merit of a paper, it's published in a scientific journal. Other scientists use published papers to evaluate and develop their own research. This is why it's important to be thorough and ethical and truthful and report everything accurately, because others will use it as well. Now, students use scientific inquiry in their classes all the time, not just science class, but especially science class. As a student, typically you're going to have the opportunity to participate and design your own investigations. When we do labs, we will have lab safety practices, um, hand out lab safety sheets. I know this quarter is going to look a little bit different for us, so things like that won't exactly be the same, but it's important to know that when you do labs, there are lab safety protocols and sheets full of information that you would typically receive. But that's going to wrap that up for us today. Again, the scientific method has its distinct little components that you need to remember. Go back through these slides if you need to, read chapter 1, section 3 if you need to. Go ahead and, when this video ends, go find the discussion board for the week, answer or respond to the topic being discussed, and make sure to respond to 2 of your classmates' responses. Give your initial post by Wednesday evening and respond to 2 classmates by Friday evening. And then on Thursday morning, the quiz for the chapter will post. And next week, we're already ready to move on to a different chapter. As usual, if you guys have any questions, send me an email, and I will talk to you soon.